Good morning and welcome to this November 30th version of Sunrise to Sunset with Pastor Gene. Well, the season of Advent has begun, and with the new beginning of a new season in the liturgical cycle of the church, that means we're looking at a different gospel for emphasis this year, and that gospel will be the Gospel of Mark. So for the next several weeks, we're going to be taking a look at what the Gospel of Mark has to say to us, and I'm going to move through this kind of like I did through the Gospel of Matthew some weeks back, where I'm going to be moving at whatever pace we need to move. So right now for this week, I'd encourage you to be looking at Mark chapters 1 and 2. We may get to chapter 2, we may not, but we're going to have some fun anyway in the Word. It's interesting to note that for the Gospel of Mark, that this is the earliest gospel that we have that's a canonical gospel. Now, there were other stories about Jesus being written. Some of those did not make it into the Bible, but this one did, and it appears to be the earliest of the four Gospels that were written. You'll notice that in the Gospel of Mark, there's an emphasis on the beginning. That's the very first two words, the beginning of the good news. And when you think about beginning, what do you think about? Well, you think about Genesis, first book of the Old Testament, and the story of creation. And when you think about the beginning, you think about in the beginning was the Word. That's the Gospel of John. So just an interesting thing here about this of similarity of how Mark begins this story of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And that's going to be very important as we go forward. The central message of the Gospel of Mark is the Passion story that's told in chapters 11 through 16. There's like a 10-chapter introduction, and all of that builds up to what's going to happen in 11 through 16. And it's interesting to note that as far as the Gospel of Mark is concerned, it's not just what the story is, but how you tell it. Back in the day when Mark was originally being used in Christian worship, it would be memorized and it would be shared with the congregation. There was points of emphasis that needed to be made by whoever it was that was sharing this gospel with the people. And you'll note as you go through the Gospel of Mark, 42 times you'll hear the word immediately. Immediately, like now, like this is now. This is not something coming foretold and we're still waiting on it. Now, immediately. So that's a key part of understanding the Gospel of Mark, the emphasis on immediately the kingdom of God is in place. There's a heavy dependence on Isaiah. You'll see references throughout all of the story of Mark that depend on that. And the role of John the Baptist will be an essential role in the Gospel of Mark. So be listening for that connection between Jesus and John the Baptist. It's interesting that Mark brings out John the Baptist very early. In fact, Mark begins talking about him in the first chapter, the second verse, in terms of the connection between John the Baptist and the voice of one crying in the wilderness. John gets to it a little bit later in verse 19 of the first chapter, but in Matthew and Luke, we don't even get to John the Baptist as a real serious, important part of the story of Jesus' ministry until chapter 3. Now, yes, John the Baptist is mentioned by Luke prior to this, but not in the functional role that he is going to serve as the forerunner of the kingdom. The miracles cease in chapter 9 as the true mission of Jesus is unfolding, that he's going to the cross and that he's going to, his mission and his call upon our life is that we deny ourselves, take up the cross, and follow him, as we read in chapter 8, verse 34. But the climax of the whole story comes in the 15th chapter, the 39th verse, when that Roman centurion, after it's all done, after Jesus bows his head and dies, when the Roman centurion says, and this is one of the people who perpetrated Jesus' death, he says, truly this man was God's Son. You know, the recognition of Jesus as God's Son is really the central message of the Gospel of Mark. And we have to wonder how we move from being the one who puts Jesus to death on the cross to the recognition of who and what Jesus is. God's message is not revealed by some saint, but by a perpetrator of the violent act of crucifixion. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Now, there's also an emphasis on the miracles. You'll hear, we'll talk a lot about those miracles in the weeks ahead. And there's healing of the deaf and the mute and the blind. And think about that for just a moment. These miracles enable one to hear, one to see, and one to speak. And when we can hear, and when we can see, and when we can speak the good news of God, that the kingdom of God has come, then what we're really talking about is not these physical ailments, but the healing of humanity. Being able to hear, see, and speak the good news of Jesus Christ, healing for the world. We need that now. This world needs that kind of healing. And I'm not just talking about COVID. I'm talking about relationships. I'm talking about trust factors. I'm talking about unity. Jesus heals all of that. I'm talking about brokenness. I'm talking about division. I'm talking about rejection. I'm talking about falsehood. Jesus heals all of that. So the big question for the Gospel of Mark, and I know this one's a little bit longer than normal, but it has to be because I want to set the stage for all of this. There's two questions that we must constantly ask as we read the Gospel of Mark. And they are, number one, who is Jesus? And number two, where is he going and why? You see, when we discover the answer to that question, we will find the good news. We will hear it. We will see it. And we will speak it from sunrise to sunset.